Electricity doesn't negotiate, doesn't warn twice, and absolutely doesn't care about your DIY confidence. What you're about to see is a compilation of 10 people who learned this the hard way. And by learned, I mean they stopped existing. This isn't entertainment for entertainment's sake. Consider it a public service announcement wrapped in dark humor. These aren't actors. These are real decisions with real consequences. Don't be number 11. 1. The internet has given humanity many gifts: instant communication, unlimited knowledge, and an endless supply of videos showing people doing incredibly dangerous things that make you think, I could totally do that in my garage. Which, spoiler alert, you absolutely cannot. Enter Gerald, a 43-year-old maker from rural Pennsylvania whose entire personality could be summarized as watched one too many YouTube tutorials and developed a god complex. Gerald had discovered fractal wood burning, a craft that involves using high-voltage electricity to burn beautiful, lightning-shaped patterns into wood. And he became obsessed with it the way normal people become obsessed with, say, not dying. The process requires a device called a Lichtenberg machine, which is essentially a microwave oven transformer, or MOT, that takes your friendly household current and cranks it up to approximately 2,000 volts of "this will absolutely end you." To give you some perspective on what Gerald was casually handling in his garage, it takes about 100 milliamps to turn a human heart into a very expensive paperweight, and a MOT delivers several amps, enough current to restart evolution if evolution made house calls. But Gerald had seen the TikToks. He'd watched the satisfying videos of electricity dancing across wooden slabs like tiny imprisoned lightning storms, and he thought, safety warnings are for people who lack vision, which is coincidentally the epitaph of roughly 30% of Darwin Award winners. Now, Gerald wasn't completely stupid, a statement I make knowing full well how this story ends, because he actually followed safety protocols for his first few projects. Rubber gloves, one hand behind his back, respectable distance from anything that could conduct his soul into the afterlife. The problem with surviving dangerous activities, though, is that your brain starts whispering sweet lies like, "You're basically an expert now," and "rules are for beginners." And Gerald's brain was apparently running a full disinformation campaign. By project number 5, Gerald had decided that safety equipment was slowing down his creative process, which is a sentence that has preceded approximately 10,000 preventable deaths throughout human history. On the fateful evening of his departure from the gene pool, Gerald was live streaming to his 14 followers. Yes, 14. This man risked 2,000 volts for an audience smaller than a book club, working on a large oak slab that wasn't cooperating with his artistic vision. The fractal pattern was spreading unevenly, which Gerald found personally offensive, so he decided to reposition the electrodes to get better results. A person with functioning survival instincts would unplug the transformer first. Gerald, who had apparently traded his survival instincts for hubris at some point in his 40s, simply reached over to adjust the metal clamps while the transformer hummed with enough voltage to make a lightning bolt jealous. His left hand grabbed the electrode clamp at the precise moment his right elbow brushed against the grounded metal workbench frame, and 2,000 volts thought, finally, a path of least resistance that goes directly through this man's chest cavity. The current traveled through his heart faster than his brain could process the words, "Maybe I should have unplugged this," causing immediate ventricular fibrillation, which is medical terminology for his heart started breakdancing and forgot how to pump blood. Gerald's body went rigid, then collapsed face first onto his half-finished masterpiece while his 14 viewers watched in confused horror, initially assuming this was some kind of bit. His live stream continued for another 6 minutes, broadcasting his motionless body to an audience that had gone from mildly entertained to frantically Googling how to report an emergency when you only know someone's username. The paramedics who arrived found the transformer still humming contentedly, completely unbothered by its role in Gerald's premature retirement from existence. The coroner listed the cause of death as electrocution, but death by impatience would have fit just as nicely on the certificate. In a final twist of irony so perfect it almost seems scripted, the oak slab Gerald died on actually had a beautiful fractal pattern burned into it, plus an additional burn mark shaped roughly like a human forearm, which, if you squint, could be considered his final artistic contribution. 2. Picture this. A dark and stormy Texas evening. a neighborhood without power, and one man who decided that electrical codes were merely suggestions written by cowards who lacked his visionary approach to home improvement. Earl was 51 years old, owned a perfectly functional portable generator, and possessed the kind of confidence that comes from successfully completing exactly 0 electrical projects but watching roughly 300 of them on YouTube. When the thunderstorm knocked out power to his subdivision, Earl saw this not as an inconvenience but as an opportunity. His chance to prove to his wife, his neighbors, and most importantly himself, that he was the self-sufficient alpha male his father always wanted him to be. Electrical engineering degree be damned. The obvious solution would be to hire an electrician to install a transfer switch, which safely connects a generator to a home's electrical panel. This would cost about $300 and take maybe 2 hours. Earl, who viewed paying professionals as a personal admission of inadequacy, chose a different path. He would build what electricians affectionately call a suicide cord and what widows call the reason I'm single now. For those blessed with enough common sense to have never encountered this device, a suicide cord is a cable with male plugs on both ends, designed to backfeed electricity from a generator into your home through a regular outlet. It's called a suicide cord because, and I cannot stress this enough, it is specifically engineered to create the maximum possible opportunity for you to die. Here's the physics that Earl either slept through or never learned. When you plug one end into a running generator, the other end has fully energized prongs just hanging out in the open air, carrying enough current to file your death certificate before you hit the ground. Earl's generator produced 240 volts at 30 amps, which, to translate into terms Earl might have understood if he'd bothered to Google literally anything, is equivalent to being attacked by approximately 6,000 angry tasers simultaneously. On the night Earl chose to exit the mortal plane, he'd set up his generator in the garage, feeling like a genuine provider, a real man's man. The kind of guy other guys would definitely respect at the hardware store. He plugged one end of his homemade death cable into the generator, watched it hum to life, and then carried the other end toward his kitchen outlet with all the caution of a man carrying a sandwich. Now, here's where Earl's brain made the fatal calculation that would earn him a permanent spot in our show. Instead of holding the plug by its insulated plastic housing like someone who wanted to see his grandchildren grow up, Earl grabbed it by the metal prongs because he wanted to guide it in more precisely. The moment his fingers touched those energized prongs, 30 amps of current entered his hand and thought, "Oh, excellent, a direct highway to ground through this man's major organs." The electricity traveled through Earl's chest, past his heart, which immediately filed a formal complaint by stopping, and exited through his feet, which were planted on the concrete garage floor like he was actively trying to maximize his conductivity. His body completed the circuit with the kind of efficiency that would earn an A+ in any physics class, though Earl was no longer available to receive the grade. His wife, sitting in the dark living room wondering why the lights hadn't come on yet, heard a single heavy thump followed by the generator continuing to run, as if absolutely nothing noteworthy had occurred. She found Earl 3 minutes later, sprawled on the garage floor, still clutching the plug in a death grip so tight the paramedics needed tools to release it. The generator hummed along in the background, cheerfully generating power that no one in the house would ever use, completely indifferent to its role as Earl's final collaborator. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as accidental electrocution, though death by frugality would have been equally accurate. The transfer switch that Earl refused to pay for? $300. The funeral his wife had to plan instead? $12,000. The lesson here? Absolutely priceless, and absolutely ignored by the next guy who thinks he's smarter than electrical codes. 3. Every generation produces young people who look at death and think, "Yeah, but have you considered the clout?" And Alexei was the 22-year-old poster child for this particular brand of ambition. Based in the outskirts of Moscow, Alexei had built his entire online identity around being a rooftopper. One of those creators who climb terrifyingly high structures without safety equipment and film themselves doing it for an audience of people who watch partly out of admiration and partly because they're subconsciously hoping to witness natural selection in real time. Alexei had conquered radio towers, construction cranes, and numerous buildings with no trespassing signs that he interpreted as personalized invitations from the universe to test his mortality. But static structures had grown boring. Buildings just sat there passively, practically begging to be climbed, which wasn't nearly dangerous enough for someone who had apparently entered into a blood feud with his own survival instincts. That's when Alexei discovered train surfing, specifically riding on the roofs of Russian commuter trains, which combined his love of heights with the thrilling addition of extreme speed and what electrical engineers call an absolutely terrifying amount of voltage directly above your head. Here's the quick physics lesson that would have saved Alexei's life if Russian schools put as much emphasis on electrical engineering as they do on literature. Russian commuter trains run on 27,000 volts of alternating current, delivered through overhead wires called catenaries. That's 27,000 volts. For comparison, a standard wall outlet delivers 220 volts and can already seriously ruin your day, so we're talking about roughly 120 times that, or enough electricity to power a small town's worth of bad decisions. Alexei knew the basic rule every train surfer learns: don't touch the wires. Simple enough, right? The wires are up there, you're down here, maintain some respectful distance and collect your internet points in peace. What Alexei's algorithm-curated education had catastrophically failed to mention, and what his approximately 45 seconds of safety research had not revealed, was that 27,000 volts doesn't actually require physical contact to kill you. At that voltage, electricity can jump through thin air itself, creating what physicists call an arc flash, and what witnesses call a person briefly becoming the sun. The exact distance varies based on humidity, temperature, and apparently how much the universe wants to teach someone a lesson. But the general rule is that 27,000 volts can leap across 50 centimeters of empty space like air is merely a suggestion. This means there's an invisible death bubble around those wires, and stepping into it is functionally identical to touching them directly, except you get the added bonus of not understanding why you're suddenly on fire. On the morning of his final content creation session, Alexei climbed onto a commuter train heading into the city, phone mounted on a selfie stick, confidence at maximum capacity, understanding of electromagnetic physics at absolute zero. His plan was elegant in its stupidity. He would stand near the pantograph, the device connecting the train to the overhead wire, and demonstrate to his followers how close he could get without touching it. He was going to showcase his bravery, his mastery of danger, his complete dominance over fear itself. What he actually showcased was the impressive electrical conductivity of the human body, and the universe's complete lack of patience for people who don't research their stunts. As the train accelerated and the pantograph reached toward the catenary wire, Alexei rose to his full height, approximately 40 centimeters from the current collector, spreading his arms wide in a triumphant pose that lasted roughly 1/3 of a second. The arc flash was visible to passengers 3 cars away, a blinding blue-white explosion that found Alexei's raised fingertips and used his body as an express highway to the grounded metal roof beneath him. 27,000 volts entered through his hand and exited through everywhere, causing instantaneous cardiac arrest while simultaneously turning significant portions of him into something the medical examiner would later describe as no longer consistent with biological life. Alexei's body remained on the roof for another 4 kilometers until the train reached the next station, where passengers who'd witnessed the flash finally convinced the conductor that something had gone very wrong up top. His phone, demonstrating the kind of durability that Alexei himself lacked, survived the incident and automatically uploaded the footage to cloud storage. The video shows the flash, a brief silhouette, and then peaceful Russian countryside scrolling past a motionless shape, generating exactly the kind of viral content Alexei had always dreamed of. Just enjoyed exclusively by people who weren't him. 4. There's a certain type of man who sees a professional with years of training doing a job and thinks, I could do that in half the time without any of that fancy education. And this particular specimen was a 47-year-old named Dennis from suburban Ohio, who had decided that electricians were basically just guys who knew which color wires to connect. Which, to be fair, is technically true in the same way that surgeons are basically just guys who know where to cut. Dennis was renovating his garage to create a workshop, and he needed to figure out if he had enough space between his electrical panel and where he wanted to put his new workbench. A normal person would measure from the outside of the panel, write down the number, and continue living their life. Dennis, who operated on a different wavelength entirely, pun absolutely intended, decided he needed the exact interior dimensions, which meant opening the panel door while it was still very much alive with electricity. Now, for those fortunate enough to have never stared into the humming maw of a live electrical panel, here's what Dennis was looking at. A metal box containing multiple circuit breakers, thick cables, bus bars carrying the full electrical load of his house, and approximately 200 amps of current that was deeply indifferent to his renovation plans. The panel was split-phase, meaning it had two hot legs of 120 volts each, which when combined delivered 240 volts, enough to power large appliances and, as Dennis was about to discover, enough to turn a tape measure into a miniature weapon of mass destruction. Dennis grabbed his trusty 25-foot metal tape measure, the kind with a rigid blade that extends and then gracefully curves under its own weight, which is a fantastic feature for measuring long distances and a catastrophic feature for measuring anything inside an energized electrical panel. He extended the tape into the panel, squinting at the measurements while completely ignoring the quiet hum of enough electrical current to power his neighbor's hot tub, his other neighbor's air conditioning, and his own imminent funeral arrangements. The tape measure blade, because it was made of metal and metal does exactly what physics tells it to do, began to bow slightly under its own weight as Dennis extended it further into the panel. At precisely the wrong moment, which was every moment Dennis spent doing this, but especially this one, the curved metal blade made contact with both bus bars simultaneously, bridging the two phases and creating what electrical engineers call an arc flash, and what everyone else calls the last thing Dennis ever saw. An arc flash is not merely an electrical shock. It's a biblical-scale explosion of superheated plasma, molten metal, and pure electromagnetic fury that can reach temperatures of 35,000 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 4 times hotter than the surface of the sun. The copper in Dennis's tape measure vaporized instantly, the plastic handle melted, and a ball of plasma roughly the size of a basketball erupted directly into his face with the force of a small bomb. The explosion was so intense that it blew Dennis backward 6 feet and set fire to his shirt, though by that point his shirt's condition was fairly low on the list of things that mattered. His wife, who was inside the house watching a cooking show, heard what she later described as a boom and then complete silence, which is never a good combination when your husband is doing electrical work. She found Dennis on the garage floor, the tape measure fused into an unrecognizable blob of metal and plastic still clutched in what remained of his right hand. The electrical panel was destroyed. The main breaker had finally tripped, about 3 seconds too late to matter, and the garage smelled like a combination of burned copper, ozone, and regret. The paramedics who arrived didn't attempt resuscitation because there wasn't anything left to resuscitate in any meaningful sense. Dennis had absorbed enough thermal energy to effectively end his biological functions before he hit the ground. The fire department documented the scene for their training materials, specifically for a presentation titled "Why We Hire Licensed Electricians," which Dennis would have found condescending if he were still available to have opinions. The truly perfect detail, the one that elevates this from mere tragedy to genuine cosmic irony, is that Dennis was measuring the panel to make room for a workbench where he planned to pursue woodworking, a hobby that, while not completely safe, rarely involves 35,000-degree plasma explosions. His widow later hired an electrician to install the new panel, paying $400 for the service, which works out to roughly $399 less than the cost of Dennis's funeral, and infinitely less than the cost of learning that some measurements aren't worth taking. 5. The retro gaming community is full of passionate enthusiasts who appreciate the warm glow of cathode ray tubes, the satisfying click of mechanical switches, and apparently the thrill of reaching inside devices that can store enough electrical charge to stop a human heart for months after being unplugged. Marcus was a 34-year-old software developer from Portland who had discovered the joys of vintage gaming and decided that playing old games on modern flat-screen TVs was for people who lacked commitment to authenticity. He wanted the genuine experience, the scan lines, the slight screen curvature, the phosphor glow, and he found his holy grail at an estate sale, a 32-inch Sony Trinitron from 1998, the kind of CRT television that weighed approximately as much as a small refrigerator and was built with the structural integrity of a Cold War bunker. The TV worked perfectly, but it was dusty, and Marcus, who kept his apartment immaculate and his vintage game collection organized by release date, could not tolerate dust inside his new prized possession. He decided to open it up and clean the interior, which is a reasonable goal approached in the most unreasonable way possible. Now, here's the thing about CRT televisions that Marcus either didn't know, didn't believe, or didn't think applied to him personally. The cathode ray tube itself functions as a giant capacitor, storing electrical charge in a way that makes just unplug it and wait hilariously inadequate as a safety protocol. A CRT can hold a charge of anywhere from 25,000 to 50,000 volts for weeks, sometimes months, after being disconnected from power, just sitting there like a patient predator waiting for someone stupid enough to reach inside without discharging it first. Professional TV repair technicians use specialized discharge tools and treat every CRT like a loaded weapon because, functionally speaking, that's exactly what it is. Marcus, armed with a can of compressed air and the confidence of someone who had successfully assembled IKEA furniture without leftover screws, removed the back panel of the Trinitron on a quiet Sunday afternoon, completely unaware that he was about to make a compelling argument for just buying a RetroTink and using a modern display like everyone else. He looked inside and saw exactly what he expected: dust, circuit boards, and the large glass bottle of the CRT itself, which looked harmless enough because deadly things often do. What Marcus didn't see, because it wasn't visually obvious, was the charge sitting in the tube's capacitance. 27,000 volts of stored potential energy waiting patiently for a path to ground, which Marcus's hand was about to generously provide. The critical component in this tragedy is the anode cap, a rubber suction cup attached to the side of the CRT that connects to the high-voltage supply. It looks completely innocuous, like something you might accidentally brush against while reaching for the dusty corners in the back, which is precisely what Marcus did. As he extended his arm into the television's chassis, his forearm made contact with the anode cap, and 27,000 volts discharged through his body with the speed and enthusiasm of electricity that had been waiting months for this exact opportunity. The shock traveled through his arm, across his chest, and through his heart, causing immediate cardiac arrest with a efficiency that would have impressed the engineers who designed the television, though presumably not for this purpose. Marcus's body seized, his arm locked in place inside the television, and he collapsed against the unit with enough force to knock it off the table, which, given that it weighed about 150 pounds, created a secondary impact that probably would have caused serious injuries to anyone who hadn't already been killed by the primary event. His roommate found him 3 hours later, initially assuming Marcus had fallen asleep in a weird position while working on something, because electrocuted by a television he hadn't even plugged in wasn't a scenario that occurred to anyone who hadn't personally witnessed it. The paramedics confirmed what was already obvious. Marcus had been dead since approximately the moment he touched that anode cap. The truly absurd detail that the responding firefighter noted in his report was that the can of compressed air was still in Marcus's other hand, finger on the trigger, as if he had died mid-spray, which he quite possibly had. The Trinitron, despite being knocked to the floor and partially responsible for a man's death, still worked perfectly when Marcus's roommate eventually tested it weeks later, because Sony built those things to survive nuclear war. Marcus's vintage game collection was donated to a local gaming museum, and the television was donated to the garbage, where it presumably waits to this day for some other curious person to reach inside without doing their research first. The shock traveled through his arm, across his chest, and through his heart, causing immediate cardiac arrest with a efficiency that would have impressed the engineers who designed the television, though presumably not for this purpose. Marcus's body seized, his arm locked in place inside the television, and he collapsed against the unit with enough force to knock it off the table, which, given that it weighed about 150 pounds, created a secondary impact that probably would have caused serious injuries to anyone who hadn't already been killed by the primary event. His roommate found him 3 hours later, initially assuming Marcus had fallen asleep in a weird position while working on something, because electrocuted by a television he hadn't even plugged in wasn't a scenario that occurred to anyone who hadn't personally witnessed it. The paramedics confirmed what was already obvious. Marcus had been dead since approximately the moment he touched that anode cap. The truly absurd detail that the responding firefighter noted in his report was that the can of compressed air was still in Marcus's other hand, finger on the trigger, as if he had died mid-spray, which he quite possibly had. The Trinitron, despite being knocked to the floor and partially responsible for a man's death, still worked perfectly when Marcus's roommate eventually tested it weeks later, because Sony built those things to survive nuclear war. Marcus's vintage game collection was donated to a local gaming museum, and the television was donated to the garbage, where it presumably waits to this day for some other curious person to reach inside without doing their research first. 6. The modern drone has given humanity the ability to capture breathtaking aerial footage, deliver packages to remote locations, and apparently make middle-aged men with poor judgment climb into restricted high-voltage facilities to retrieve a $400 piece of consumer electronics. Meet Craig, a 52-year-old real estate agent from Nevada, who had recently purchased a DJI Mavic to take aerial photos of properties and who had, over the course of approximately 2 weeks, developed the kind of emotional attachment to this drone that most people reserve for family pets or children. Craig was practicing his flying skills at a park near his neighborhood when a gust of wind caught his drone and sent it tumbling over the chain-link fence of an electrical substation. One of those facilities filled with massive transformers, insulators the size of fire hydrants, and warning signs so numerous and explicit that they essentially function as a written multiple-choice test, where the only question is, do you want to die today? Craig watched his beloved drone land on top of a transformer housing, sitting there perfectly intact, clearly visible, and absolutely surrounded by enough voltage to power several thousand homes simultaneously. A rational person would file an insurance claim, call the utility company, or simply accept that the drone now belonged to the electrical grid. Craig, whose relationship with rationality had always been complicated, looked at those warning signs. The ones showing stick figures being struck by lightning. The ones with skulls. The ones that literally said, "Danger, high voltage, keep out," and decided they were probably just being dramatic. The fence was only 8 feet tall, and Craig had a good 4 decades of climbing experience from his youth. So over he went, dropping into the substation with the confidence of a man who had absolutely no understanding of what he'd just dropped into. Here's what Craig didn't know about electrical substations and what the warning signs were trying desperately to communicate before he ignored them. The equipment inside operates at voltages ranging from 69,000 to 500,000 volts, and at those levels, electricity doesn't need you to touch anything to kill you. The air itself becomes a conductor when voltage gets high enough, creating arc flashes that can jump several feet through empty space and reach temperatures hot enough to vaporize metal. The insulators, those ribbed ceramic or polymer things that look like oversized chess pieces, exist specifically because even air provides inadequate insulation at these voltages. Craig didn't need to touch the wires, he just needed to get close enough for the electricity to reach out and touch him, which he was about to do with remarkable efficiency. Armed with a long metal pipe he'd found near the fence, probably left behind by actual utility workers who knew better than to use it near energized equipment, Craig approached the transformer where his drone sat, planning to knock it down like a kid retrieving a frisbee from a rooftop. As he raised the metal pipe and stepped closer to the equipment, he entered the arc distance of the high-voltage terminal, the invisible boundary where air stops being an insulator and becomes a pathway for current. He never made contact with anything. The arc flash reached out to meet him first, jumping approximately 4 feet from the terminal to his raised pipe, through the conductive metal directly into his hands, and then through his body with 138,000 volts of current that cared absolutely nothing about his real estate career, his drone photography hobby, or his plans for the rest of the afternoon. The flash was visible from the road, a brilliant blue-white explosion that lasted a fraction of a second and accomplished everything it needed to in that time. Craig's body was thrown backward by the blast, landing in a heap approximately 10 feet from where he'd been standing, with burns severe enough that the medical examiner would later note the cause of death as electrocution with extensive thermal injuries, which is clinical language for this man was briefly on fire from the inside. The utility company's automatic systems detected the fault and dispatched a crew within 20 minutes who found Craig's body, his charred stick, and his drone still sitting perfectly intact on the transformer housing, undamaged, fully charged, and worth exactly none of the cost Craig had paid to retrieve it. The company issued a statement reminding the public that substations are dangerous and that warning signs exist for reasons, a message that would have been extremely useful to Craig approximately 1 hour earlier. His drone was eventually retrieved by trained professionals using proper insulated equipment, and it worked perfectly. the final insult in a story full of them. Craig's family later received the drone along with his other personal effects, and one can only imagine the emotional complexity of seeing the device that their father and husband had valued more than explicit death warnings and basic self-preservation. 7. Farming is one of those professions that combines the peaceful imagery of pastoral life with the statistical reality of being one of the most dangerous jobs in America. And nothing exemplifies this contradiction quite like the story of Harold, a 61-year-old grain farmer from Nebraska, who had survived 6 decades of heavy machinery, unpredictable weather, and livestock with anger management issues, only to be done in by a fundamental misunderstanding of how electricity chooses its path to ground. Harold had been farming his family's land since he was old enough to see over a steering wheel, and in that time he had developed the kind of casual relationship with danger that comes from doing hazardous things so many times that they stop feeling hazardous, which is precisely the mental state that precedes approximately 80% of farm-related fatalities. On the day in question, Harold was repositioning his grain auger, a large piece of equipment that looks like a giant metal screw inside a tube, and is used to move grain from one place to another because apparently grain is too good to move itself. The auger was mounted on a trailer with rubber wheels, a detail that Harold's brain registered and then filed under completely irrelevant information, when it was, in fact, the single most relevant piece of information in his entire life at that moment. As Harold towed the auger across his property with his tractor, he needed to maneuver it between a storage shed and a power line that crossed overhead. A power line carrying 7,200 volts of rural electricity that had been hanging there for 40 years without incident, patiently waiting for someone to finally make its acquaintance in the worst possible way. Harold had cleared this line hundreds of times before. He knew it was there the way he knew where his own furniture was, which is to say he'd stopped actively thinking about it years ago. But today, the auger was extended to its full height for transport, and as he guided it under the line, the top of the metal tube made contact with the wire, and 7,200 volts of electricity suddenly had a very strong opinion about Harold's afternoon plans. Here's where physics becomes either your best friend or your executioner, depending on whether you understand it. When the auger touched the power line, the entire metal structure became energized with enough voltage to power a small neighborhood. However, and this is crucial, the rubber tires on the trailer were acting as insulators, preventing the current from flowing into the ground. The electricity was there, surrounding every inch of metal, but it had nowhere to go. Harold, still sitting in his tractor with its own rubber tires, was technically safe at this moment, though safe is a relative term when you're sitting next to a 7,000-volt death trap waiting for someone to complete its circuit. If Harold had stayed in the tractor, called the power company, and waited for professionals to handle the situation, he would have lived to complain about the government, the weather, and whatever else farmers complain about for many more years. Instead, Harold looked back, saw that the auger was touching the line, and thought, "I should probably move that," which was his last thought that contained any practical value. He climbed down from the tractor, still safe because he wasn't touching the auger, walked over to the trailer and grabbed the metal handle to manually reposition the equipment away from the line. The moment his hand made contact with the energized metal while his boots stood on the actual earth, Harold's body became the path of least resistance between 7,200 volts and the ground it so desperately wanted to reach. The current entered through his hand, traveled through his chest, past his heart, which immediately stopped doing the one job it had, and exited through his feet into the Nebraska soil that his family had farmed for 3 generations. Harold was dead before his brain could even process the sensation of being electrocuted, which is perhaps the only mercy in this entire story. His body was found by his son 2 hours later, still slumped against the trailer, hand still on the handle, the auger still touching the power line. The whole scene looking like a grotesque educational diagram about electrical grounding that someone had forgotten to label. The power company representative who responded to the scene later noted that Harold could have survived simply by jumping away from the trailer without touching the ground, a move called the shuffle step that utility workers are trained to use in exactly this situation. But Harold wasn't a utility worker. He was a farmer who thought he understood electricity because he'd replaced a few light switches, and that confidence gap between replaced light switches and can safely handle 7,000 volts turned out to be exactly wide enough to fit a casket. The truly grim irony is that the power line Harold touched had been scheduled for burial underground the following spring as part of a rural modernization project. A decision made specifically because overhead lines in agricultural areas kept killing farmers who touched them with tall equipment. Harold missed the upgrade by 8 months, which is the kind of timing that would be darkly comedic if it weren't someone's actual death. 8. There's a specific type of panic that makes people do exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment. And nobody demonstrated this principle more thoroughly than Victor, a 44-year-old dump truck driver from rural Texas, who had approximately 90 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died, and who used those 90 seconds to choose death with the kind of commitment most people reserve for their careers or marriages. Victor had been driving dump trucks for 15 years, hauling gravel, sand, dirt, and occasionally questionable life choices across the Texas countryside. And he had developed the easy confidence of someone who had done a dangerous job long enough to forget it was dangerous. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Victor was finishing a delivery at a construction site, dumping a load of crushed limestone that nobody would ever think about again after this story. He raised the truck bed to empty the load, watching in his mirrors as the limestone cascaded out, completely unaware that his raised bed was ascending directly toward a high-voltage power line that crossed the site at a height the construction company had apparently decided was probably fine. The truck bed made contact with the line at approximately 2:47 p.m., and 13,800 volts of electricity immediately turned Victor's dump truck into the world's most terrifying Faraday cage. For those unfamiliar with the concept, a Faraday cage is an enclosure made of conductive material that distributes electrical charge around its exterior, protecting whatever is inside from electrical fields. It's why you're safe inside a car during a lightning storm. And it's why Victor was, at this exact moment, completely safe inside his metal truck cab, despite being connected to enough voltage to power a small town. The electricity was flowing through the metal frame of the truck, looking for a path to ground. But the rubber tires were providing insulation, and the current was essentially doing laps around the truck's exterior, like a frustrated runner on a track. Victor was surrounded by death but untouched by it, a situation that required exactly one thing from him: stay inside the truck and wait for help. What Victor did instead was look out his window, see sparks showering from the contact point, watch his tires begin to smoke from the heat of the current trying to arc through them, and decide that he needed to exit this vehicle immediately, which was the electrical equivalent of being safely inside a bomb shelter and deciding the bombs outside looked interesting. The correct procedure in this situation, and this is taught to every commercial driver who might encounter power lines, is to either stay inside the vehicle until power is cut, or, if you absolutely must exit due to fire, to jump clear of the vehicle without touching it and the ground simultaneously, then shuffle away with small steps to avoid step potential. Victor did none of these things. Victor opened his door, grabbed the metal handle to steady himself, and stepped down onto the ground with one foot while his other hand maintained contact with the truck's frame. In that moment, Victor's body became the only available path between 13,800 volts and the earth it wanted to reach, and electricity is not known for its patience or its mercy. The current flowed from the power line, through the truck frame, through Victor's arm, across his chest, through his heart, down his leg, and into the ground, completing a circuit that Victor's body was spectacularly unqualified to be part of. Witnesses at the construction site described a bright flash, a sound like a thunderclap, and Victor's body being thrown several feet from the truck, though thrown implies a gentleness that the actual physics did not provide. The foreman who called 911 initially reported a possible explosion before realizing that the explosion was, in fact, a person. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, but Victor had been dead since approximately the moment his boot touched Texas soil, his heart having received enough electrical current to never beat again. The dump truck, ironically, was barely damaged. A few scorch marks on the tires, some melted rubber, but structurally sound and fully functional once the power line was de-energized. It was towed away and eventually returned to service, hauling loads for another driver who presumably paid much closer attention to overhead clearances. The power company's investigation concluded that Victor would have survived if he had remained in the vehicle, a finding that surprised exactly no one who understood basic electrical safety, but that served as a painful reminder that knowing something theoretically and knowing it when your tires are on fire are two very different types of knowledge. Victor's family received a settlement from the construction company for failing to mark the power line's location, money that Victor would have gladly traded for the 30 seconds of patience that would have saved his life. 9. The gig economy has created an entire generation of people whose livelihood depends on keeping their devices charged at all times, which has led to some creative solutions for finding power in public spaces, and in at least one documented case, to a death so stupid it could serve as a cautionary tale for anyone who has ever looked at municipal infrastructure and thought, I bet I could tap into that. Dmitry was a 28-year-old food delivery courier in Kiev, Ukraine. Because bad decisions, much like electricity, respect no international borders, who had built his entire income around his electric scooter and his smartphone, two devices that required constant charging and that Dmitry had come to view as extensions of his own body rather than the battery-dependent machines they actually were. On the night that would prove to be his last, Dmitry was working a late shift, zipping between restaurants and apartments, when his scooter's battery hit 15% and his phone wasn't doing much better. The nearest charging station was 20 minutes away, and Dmitry had 3 more deliveries queued up, which meant finding power somewhere closer or losing income that his rent depended on. A calculation that led him to make a decision so monumentally stupid that electrical engineers use it in training seminars as an example of what happens when desperation overrides basic survival instincts. Dmitry had noticed, during his countless hours riding through the city at night, that streetlights had service panels at their bases, metal doors that utility workers opened to perform maintenance. He had also noticed, during one particularly slow evening, that these panels weren't always locked, and that inside them were electrical connections that, to someone with absolutely no electrical training, looked like potential charging opportunities. On this night, Dmitry found a streetlight in a quiet park with a service panel that was indeed unlocked, probably because the lock had been broken by a previous person with a similarly terrible idea. And he made the fateful decision to open it and see if he could borrow some electricity for his devices. Now, here's what Dmitry didn't know. Because Dmitry's expertise was in food delivery rather than municipal electrical systems. Streetlights in urban areas don't run on the gentle 220 volts that power household outlets. They run on 380 volts of three-phase industrial power, delivered through connections that are designed to be serviced by trained professionals wearing insulated gloves and using specialized tools, not by hungry delivery guys with a phone charger and a dream. The interior of a streetlight base is also not designed for human hands. It's a cramped metal box where live wires are packed close together, and where touching the wrong thing means touching several wrong things simultaneously. Dmitry, working by the light of his dying phone, managed to identify what he thought were the power terminals and began attempting to connect a USB cable he had spliced with exposed wires, a modification he had made himself using skills he had acquired from a YouTube video that was definitely not intended for this purpose. In the cramped confines of the service panel, with his hands working in near darkness among wires he couldn't properly identify, Dmitry's left hand made contact with the phase conductor, while his right hand was braced against the metal housing of the streetlight pole. 380 volts of current, significantly more than the amount required to cause cardiac arrest, flowed through his arms and across his chest, stopping his heart with the kind of efficiency that suggests electricity takes its job very seriously. Dmitry's body slumped against the base of the streetlight, one hand still inside the service panel, the other still clutching his spliced charging cable, in a pose that perfectly illustrated the gap between his plan and reality. He was found the next morning by a jogger who initially thought he was a homeless person sleeping against the pole, a misunderstanding that lasted until the jogger got close enough to notice the burns on Dmitry's hands, and the distinct smell of electrical damage that no amount of optimism could explain away. The responding officers noted that Dmitry's scooter, parked nearby, still had 12% battery remaining, enough to have made it to a legitimate charging station if he had just accepted a slightly longer route. His phone, which had been in his pocket during the electrocution, was completely fried, the battery having apparently decided to join its owner in death through some sympathetic electronic failure. The food delivery company Dmitry worked for issued a statement reminding couriers to use only authorized charging locations, a policy that had apparently existed but that Dmitry had never read, possibly because reading company policies doesn't generate delivery income. His final 3 deliveries were reassigned to other couriers, the restaurants refunded, and the customers mildly inconvenienced. A footnote to a death that proved definitively that no amount of gig economy hustle is worth treating municipal electrical infrastructure as a personal charging station. 10. Every person who has ever been interested in science has, at some point, wanted to build something that makes impressive sparks. And the Jacob's ladder sits at the top of this particular wish list. A device that creates a continuous electrical arc that climbs dramatically between two electrodes, looking like a special effect from a 1930s Frankenstein movie, and posing roughly the same danger to anyone stupid enough to touch it. Kenneth was a 39-year-old accountant from Minnesota who had discovered a passion for high-voltage experiments approximately 18 months before this passion discovered a way to kill him. His garage had gradually transformed from a place where cars were parked into a laboratory filled with increasingly dangerous equipment: Tesla coils, capacitor banks, Van de Graaff generators, and finally, the Jacob's ladder that would serve as both his masterpiece and his memorial. Building a Jacob's ladder is, mechanically speaking, not that complicated. You need a high-voltage transformer, two metal electrodes arranged in a V-shape, and a complete disregard for the fact that you're creating a device specifically designed to generate continuous electrical arcs at voltages that can stop human hearts. Kenneth had sourced a neon sign transformer that provided 15,000 volts, mounted it to a wooden base with the kind of craftsmanship that suggested he was much better at building dangerous things than he was at respecting them, and positioned his copper electrodes with the precision of someone who had watched many YouTube tutorials but attended zero electrical safety courses. The device worked beautifully. Arcs would form at the narrow bottom of the V and climb dramatically upward as the heated air rose, creating exactly the kind of mad scientist aesthetic that Kenneth had been dreaming about since childhood. He filmed it, showed it to friends, and operated it dozens of times without incident, which is the most dangerous possible outcome for someone engaging in risky behavior because it creates the illusion that the behavior isn't actually risky. On the evening of his death, Kenneth was running his Jacob's ladder for a video he planned to post online, demonstrating modifications he had made to create larger, more impressive arcs. The device was humming along beautifully, electricity dancing between the electrodes, when Kenneth noticed that one of the copper rods had shifted slightly out of alignment, probably due to the heat warping the mounting bracket. The arc was now climbing crookedly, which bothered Kenneth's sense of aesthetics in a way that would prove to be incompatible with his continued existence. A person with proper electrical training would shut down the device, wait for any residual charge to dissipate, verify the system was de-energized, and then make the adjustment. Kenneth, whose electrical training consisted entirely of internet forums and trial and error, simply reached toward the electrode to nudge it back into position, his brain apparently having decided that the continuous electrical arc visibly jumping between the electrodes was somehow not a warning sign. His hand entered the arc path approximately 3 inches from the electrode, which was close enough for 15,000 volts to decide that Kenneth's arm was a more interesting path than the air it had been traveling through. The arc jumped to his hand and found a path to ground through his body, delivering a shock that caused immediate cardiac arrest and muscle contraction so severe that Kenneth's hand actually grabbed the electrode he had been reaching for, maintaining contact and continuing to conduct current even after his heart had stopped. The Jacob's ladder kept running for another 4 minutes until the transformer overheated and shut down automatically, during which time Kenneth's body remained locked to the electrode in a grip that his living muscles would never have been able to maintain. His wife found him when she came to the garage to ask about dinner, discovering her husband standing rigidly upright, hand fused to a copper rod, with burns on his palm that told a story she didn't need a detective to interpret. The paramedics who responded had to use insulated tools to separate Kenneth from his creation, a process that took longer than anyone was comfortable with, and that provided material for the nightmares of everyone present. The coroner's report noted that Kenneth had likely been dead within seconds of contact, which was small comfort to a family that had lost him to a device he had built specifically to look impressive and had succeeded beyond anyone's reasonable expectations. Kenneth's high-voltage equipment was donated to a local hackerspace with the explicit condition that they implement safety protocols Kenneth had never bothered with, a legacy that presumably saves lives, even if it couldn't save his own. His final video, recovered from the camera that had been recording when he died, was never posted online. though it apparently shows, in perfect clarity, the exact moment Kenneth's hand enters the Ark, followed by approximately 4 minutes of footage that no one who has seen it has ever wanted to describe.